Welcome to the August 6, 2012 Glendale Water and Power Commission meeting. Start with roll call, please.
Commissioner Jemian?
Present.
Commissioner Chan?
Present.
Detler? Yao?
Present.
President Armenian?
Present. Next item, please.
2A, approval of the July 2nd, 2012 meeting minutes.
Do we have any changes, comments? Can I get a motion? Is
Move to approve.
there a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Next item, please.
3A, report on electric rate outreach efforts. Steve Zern?
Mr. President, members of the Commission, I want to take this opportunity. As the last time that we met, we had briefly gone over what was going to be our strategy for conducting community outreach, for getting out to the public and talking about the condition of the utility, the transition we're going through, and most importantly, some proposed rate increases that we were looking at for the electrical side of the operation. I'm going to ask Martin Powers to come up and help me here. He's been invaluable in assisting me in putting this all together. But what I wanted to show here, if we could go to the next slide, is we'll get right to where we held public meetings. And beginning in mid-July, our first meeting was a daytime meeting that we had wanted to focus on the business community being able to meet with us during the day. That was held here on the Civic Center campus. We had a pretty fair attendance at that one with 32. That evening we went out to Maple Park in the southern part of the city. We then went up to the northern part of the city where we had a meeting at Spar Heights Community Center, and then we went even further north up to Clark Magnet High School on the 18th of July. We conducted a meeting in cooperation with the Armenian National Committee at the Glendale Youth Center on July 25th. And then we finalized at least our outreach to this point before we came to talk to you with a special Chamber of Commerce meeting on August 2nd where we had 16 attendees. So we probably had somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 attendees at all of the meetings. The discussion was, I thought, very good. The input was very good. I'll have to be frank with you that it seemed to me, and to preface that, Mr. Powers has done a fine job of recording everything that was asked question-wise. We're finalizing that and putting together. I'll send you an email of that so you can see specifically what some of the questions are. But to sum it up, there was a lot of questions about the transfer to the general fund. It seemed less questions specifically about rate increases, more interest, concern, questions about this transfer issue. Ms. Godinez was at every meeting. She was able to, as always, answer those. Mr. Ochoa attended one of the meetings, was able to respond to those kind of questions as well. But a lot of it was interest in hearing in the public at council meetings and through others in the community of certain concerns and issues with that. That was brought up quite a bit. I wanted to also show you what, in not just the community meetings, but where we advertised throughout the community in various multilingual publications to get the message out. And Martin, help me, how many times did we advertise in each of these publications?
2 each, so a weekday and a weekend.
And then we had some wonderful assistance in just getting flyers out. And we were able to utilize some volunteers, some city employees, some of our advisory committee members who volunteered to help us, and some of our own staff who got these flyers distributed out to a variety of organizations. Mr. Ochoa had an op-ed piece in the Glendale News Press. Mr. Ochoa also went on Armenian language television, 2 different television programs to talk about different things, including the outreach meetings and the upcoming community meetings that we were going to be holding. And then the first meeting we had at the community center, we filmed that. Our GTV6 staff filmed that entire meeting, and we ran that on GTV6 continuously up until about last week.
Correct.
So that was looping on there as well for folks who couldn't attend the meeting but got the full presentation and a flavor for some of the questions that were being asked. We had our website up with all of the information. We had this on social media, not only YouTube, but we had it on Facebook and Twitter. And help me, Martin, we had quite a few hits on that.
Our video was viewed at least 289 unique times. There were more views, but what we could distill it down to is 289 unique views on YouTube. And we did utilize other city social media platforms, the libraries, the parks, city manager's office to help get the word out to their followers who might not necessarily be GWP followers.
So I think that sums up the various venues and media outlets that we used, along with our own community meetings. We had a pretty fair amount of staff at each of the community meetings so that we could answer the broad range of questions. We made presentations on our capital infrastructure and the need for that, the financial situation with the utility. We talked about the transition. There were questions about that, the management transition in the utility. So although attendance was probably lower than we had hoped, I think the questions were good and the concern was evident on the part of the residents. With that said, I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Now, I should sum it up by saying, while there's always room for improvement, no question about it, we learned a lot from this process. I think the whole outreach effort that the GWP staff has put forth on this is somewhat unprecedented in its scope and in its detail. And so for that, I'm proud. But like I said, there's always room for improvement. And so any questions, comments, or concerns, we'll certainly take those into consideration. But I think starting with the advisory committee, going all the way through to our public outreach meetings and the social media we used, I think we did something that hasn't been done before in getting out and touching the public with regards to where we are with the utility and some of the proposed rate increases that we wanted to discuss. So with that, myself, we have other staff members who are here to answer any questions you may have about the outreach.
Any questions?
I was not able to attend any of the sessions. So my question is, were actual rate scenarios presented to the public?
Yes, Commissioner Chan, we did. We presented really, we looked at two scenarios. One, which was the original scenario that for lack of a better term, I'll say I inherited when I came here, that the staff was looking at. And then we reconsidered that in light of the situation we were in, and we showed a different scenario at a little bit lower rate over a 4-year period, actually a 5-year period with 4 increases. And we did that to show what the total would be. It was roughly 14.7% total over the 5-year span. We also then broke that down so that people could begin to see what it would be for an average single-family home, an average multifamily unit, a business, small to medium business, larger business. We showed the low-income number and then our low-income program and how that would offset the increase. There was also some pretty healthy discussion about low income in general and whether or not we could offer any greater incentive than we were currently offering, and that's something I certainly said we would look into further to the extent that we could. So we did do that. I have a copy of the presentation that I will also email you along with Mr. Powers' detailed notes on the meeting, so you can see those two together. We basically went through a history of the utility and then got to where one of the core issues, which is our capital infrastructure, and how that is translated into this tremendous reliability that the utility has now and how that relates to the customers, and then moved into a little bit of the smart grid, and then we talked about specifically finances.
So how were those scenarios, how were they received?
I think generally we had fewer questions than I had imagined we would about the rates themselves. Certainly depending on the venue we were at, folks may have been a little bit more concerned about a particular increase, especially in light of if there was a large number of people who were in that low-income bracket who were concerned about that, or their relatives and so forth. But again, I think most of the discussion centered around questions about the transfer, questions about the history of some of our capital expenditures. So it gave us an opportunity to go back and say, these are very expensive endeavors. And you know, I think a lot of people were were actually, I think the education process was very worthwhile. When we began to show, we had a pie chart, for instance, that showed where our expenditures go on an annual basis using this year's budget. I think people were really interested to see how much money we spend buying power. Just the sheer amount of money that we spend to buy power and fuel and transmit that and distribute that here in Glendale. The amount of capital that we spend and how, $30 to $50 million is not that much. And that's a good year for us to continue to keep our distribution system, the power plant, our substructure, our substation operations, up and running so that this reliability issue is at the forefront. And I think a lot of folks, it was new to them, and in that respect, the education process was very good. I think, for instance, when we talk to the Chamber of Commerce, these are medium to small businesses, some large businesses, no doubt, but they're all experiencing the same economic issues that many of us are. Us as a utility business, but them as well, and they express concern over a rate increase and how that would impact their business. So I think we probably had more discussion at the chamber meeting specifically on rates than we had at any of our other meetings.
Apologize for coming in a little late, so I might have missed something. Forgive me if you already addressed this. Why weren't we given in our packets today the copy of the PowerPoint or the slides so that we'd have the same info that the community?
And I apologize for not putting that in there. When we put the packets together, I didn't have that at the time, so that it got out before I had that. But you'll have that all within a day or two, along with the recap of the community events.
I guess I'm disappointed because when I saw the agenda when it came to me by email, and I saw we were going to be getting the report on the outreach efforts. To me, that goes hand in hand with what the information was communicated in the outreach efforts. So it seems like it's reaching this body after it's reached the community, so I'm disappointed.
Well, Ms. Dentler, there's no question it would have got to you after we had put it out in the community outreach event, because we didn't have it quite completed at the time that we talked to you at the last commission meeting.
But you had it today.
I had it today, but I'm sorry. As for an information only, I'd forgotten about it, and it's my fault. I take responsibility for that, but you'll have it. As you know, we'll be making a very similar presentation to the City Council on the 14th, but I'll make sure that you have that within a day or two, much before that council meeting.
Similar presentation to what we just had, or to what you're going to be emailing us?
To what the council? The
yeah.
council is going to get a very similar presentation to what you're getting today in general as the commission. So
Okay.
the community outreach discussion, Ms. Godinez's discussion on some of the legal issues that have been under analysis in the city attorney's office, and then recapping what we've done to this point.
Before we move on to the legal analysis of the fund, so where are we with the electric rate proposal? Where are we?
Well, at this point in time, we're going to take this package to the City Council. This is an information only to you, but certainly if there's any comments, we will record those. We'll take a very similar package to the City Council, showing what we've done on the outreach, some of the feedback we've gotten from the community. We'll give them the legal opinion on Prop 26 and the transfer issue, and then we will talk to them about any other aspects of where we've been to this point, and then seek their direction on where we go from here. There will be no specific rate proposal. We're simply looking for their direction. Would they like us to pursue a rate proposal and then return to you, the commission, and then to the council, or would they like us to do something different?
Mm-hmm. So there's no rate proposal going to council?
No.
In your opinion, first let me say that it would be good to have an actual document documenting the feedback from the community based on, I know you went through this report, but also kind of something that summarizes the main issues that were brought up. So I look forward to seeing that document. I think that's really important for council to see as well as this commission. But based upon what you've seen, and I went to 2 of the meetings, so I have a sense of some of the issues, but what, in your opinion, are the top 2 issues that came up in all of the meetings.
I think, Mr. President, I would have to say it was the general fund transfer, and probably second to that was in general, whether you were a resident or whether you were a business, was just, we understand for the most part that you're running a business, and we want the infrastructure to be kept up, and we want that reliability to be there, but also consider the situation we're in and to the extent that we're dealing with and struggling with the economy as well. And whatever you can do to find that happy medium. Can you take an extra year? Can we go 1 year no raise and then or increase and then move from there? So I just think it's overall folks wanting us to be cognizant and as we are and as I hope we were able to convey about the situation that many of our residents and customers are facing as a result of the downturn in the economy.
Mm-hmm. It seems to me that I know based on our last commission meeting that the GWP management was moving pretty aggressively with an aggressive timeline in terms of moving forward with with a proposed rate increase. But correct me if I'm wrong, what I'm reading here is that based upon the feedback from these variety of forums, you seem to be taking a step back to ensure that you have some city council direction in terms of what direction they want to go in.
That's correct, Mr. President. I think when I came into this at the end of May, and then later you heard Mr. Ochoa say on a couple of occasions, we want to make sure that everybody's comfortable with where we're going. We don't want to set a date and say it's a drop-dead date that we have to do something by then. It was a pretty aggressive schedule when I came in, but I was given the opportunity by Mr. Ochoa to evaluate it and see, did I think it was too fast? Did I think we might need more time? Did I think we might need more direction? And I think at the end of the day, it is a good step back. I call it adding this intermediate step into the process where we go back and make a presentation to you on where we're at and then subsequently go to the council and make that same presentation and see if they're comfortable with where we're going, how fast we're going, or would they like us to do something different.
So I think that's commendable, first of all, to note that the public's feedback does matter. And in this case, it has obviously caused you to take a step back to evaluate kind of where you're going and how you're going about it. I did have a specific question, though. You did mention the general rate transfer as one of the issues that kept coming up. Is it coming up from the same people showing up to each of the meetings, or is it coming up, generally speaking, from a broader part of the population?
Mr. President, trying to cull out the fact that there was a regular group of people who attended and that subject was pretty much at the forefront of their discussions. I think there was other people, first-timers, people I hadn't seen, who looked at it more from the standpoint of some was educate me on this. What exactly is this? It's not something I've heard about or knew about. I'm hearing a lot about it. Other folks who may have known a little bit about it but didn't quite know the details and looked at it more negatively because that's how it had been portrayed, when in fact we're able to try to explain it a little bit better and where it goes, and that this isn't money that goes out the door, so to speak, but goes right back into general fund operations, and how those general fund operations then turn right around and help you. We use comparisons to investor-owned utilities and the dividends that are paid to board members, and as the city's utility, this is in one sense the dividend that they pay to the general fund to maintain all of the services that the general fund provide. I think that I hope that answers your question, but I think that was kind of the mix of the way I viewed it.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my observations, it's clear that there's quite a bit to do to educate the public about what the general fund transfer is, where it goes, and how it's put to use back into the city and to whatever operations. We can always debate the merits of how much goes where, but I think, by only having a piece of the picture, which is that this amount of money is going from GWP to general fund, is not the complete picture. We need to look at the whole picture, even though it's not 100% this commission's jurisdiction, but I think it's important, generally speaking, I'm making a general comment here, that the public be aware of the general fund transfer, and that's why I have been on the record to say I strongly believe that if we're going to be using the utility to collect these taxes for the purposes of the city, we need to line item that amount in people's bill so that they know exactly what amount of what they're paying to GWP is going for other purposes other than GWP. So I know I've spoken with the city manager and yourself about that, but I think as you think about what are the things you might do in the overall package, not just the rate increase, you should also think about how we can be more transparent to the public regarding those amounts.
And Mr. President, excellent point. And yes, in fact, you and I have had that conversation. Recently, the utility presented to the City Council, and the City Council approved a new contract with a firm that does our bill printing and mailing. Part of that included an increase in our contingency to retool the bill for exactly that reason, so that we can begin to show an explanation. However that may be, do we show that pie chart? Do we show what part of your bill goes towards the transfer, what that transfer in fact pays and funds in the general fund? So that's part of our effort in this coming year, is to totally restructure our bill, and with an emphasis on talking a little bit more about the transfer and explaining it a little bit more.
Okay, and I hope this commission will have an opportunity to weigh in on where that goes as well.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I have one final question. That's to Mr. Powers. I agree with Mr. Zern's assessment that this is probably one of the most comprehensive outreach efforts. However, like all efforts, there's always room for improvement, as he mentioned. By your observation, you were in the process, you were leading the effort to organize them. How would you improve this in the future on future issues in terms of how we may engage with the public?
I think early and often is what needs to be done. I think that we could have, given the time frame, we did the best that we could do, but I think that we need to engage the public in different areas of the city, really make an effort to get it to the northwest and to get to various corners of the city. Also, I think it's important to really partner with community-based organizations to utilize their stakeholders and their members to help get the word out, because there's only so much that we can do with a bill insert or a mailer or an ad in the newspaper. We really need help from within the community to spread the word. So.
And Mr. Zern, I assume, depending on where City Council directs you to go next with this issue, if it is to proceed, will you do additional community outreach at that point, or do you feel like you've done enough?
Mr. President, that is certainly something we will discuss at the same time. We'll ask, time frame wise, would you like us to push this back, if it in fact is their desire to move forward with some form of a proposal, and should we do more outreach? If you ask me my recommendation, I don't think it would hurt to do a little bit more, especially in this vein. Like I said, we've learned a lot. I've been very encouraged by what I found. We certainly have set a new bar in the utility. This will be something that we do as a standard practice, and to keep improving on that, as we've talked about. But certainly that's something I'm prepared to talk with them about and say, if we need to reach out a little bit more, if there's some specialized groups, such as the way the Chamber did this, or the Armenian National Committee decided that they asked us to come out and talk to some of their members. Martin mentioned Northwest, and maybe some of the other homeowners groups that would like more individual attention. I think those are all things, if we had a little bit more time, we could have worked more of those in, but I certainly would be up for doing that.
Well, I agree with your assessment, Mr. Powers, in terms of working with the community-based organizations, because if you can pull in their constituencies, it helps engage more people in the dialogue.
Absolutely.
Okay, any other questions?
Last question.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just have a question in general regarding the outreach effectiveness and the measurement of success, because I've heard in the past when the public is interested in how we're going about doing outreach. So you mentioned, Mr. Zern, that we'll set a new standard for our utility in terms of outreach. How do you determine that? I mean, is it just by the number of magazines and newspapers that we publicize, or by the number of attendees? So in the future, how can we improve upon that if we have any kind of metrics or measurement of success?
Commissioner, yeah, I think that's very, very difficult. And I will tell you, in my time, both in Public Works and now through this effort, I'll give you a recent example. We had an issue facing the city called, it was referred to as a road diet. We were looking at one particular street where we were going to do a road diet. We didn't do nearly the outreach we did on this particular effort, and we filled Spar Heights twice. It was emotional, and it was something people were dialed into. I don't know if that's that plays into it, depending on the issue itself. I think it does have something to do with it. Certainly, as I said, we can always make improvements, but at the end of the day, all we can do is try to reach the maximum number of people we can and to try to make it as convenient as possible for them to get out and talk to us, even if it's a matter of doing it online or being able to take in that case, emails, or even if we were to do it on the phone with people calling in and expressing their concerns. I think it's hard to say that it wasn't successful because we only had 27 or 28 people per meeting. We reached out to thousands and thousands of people and put this out in a way that we had never done before. Again, can we do better? You bet. Is there some things we're going to sit down, debrief, and learn from? Absolutely, we're going to do that. But I have to believe that in some cases, the circumstances, the timing, the issue, they all play into it as well. I think the best we can do is try to reach out to as many people and make it as convenient as we can, as I said, to get their word, to get them the information and to get their feedback back.
Well, just an additional follow-up on that, as you can tell from some newspaper comments where they mentioned that the utility is there to maybe just to be there to listen, but not to take their comments wholeheartedly. How do you respond to those type of comments?
Well, Commissioner Yao, I'm new to this utility, and maybe some of you have had experience with me. I don't say things just to say them. If I'm there to listen to you, I take those to heart. Obviously, it's very difficult to respond and to please every single person as you go out and do these kind of things. But certainly everything that was said, as I said, Mr. Powers took it down in detail, and I listened to it and I took it to heart. I wasn't there just as an exercise to show up and say, we did this. I was there to listen. I wanted to hear what the feedback was. I wanted to hear if the direction we were going was right. I wanted to hear if we missed something because, again, looking back to the water rate, I wasn't involved in that, but having gone through with now the Water Rate Advisory Committee doing a postmortem, and President Armenian was involved in that, I heard a lot of things from them that we could have done better. I think we improved a lot of those when we did the electrical rate process, and I think we can do even more. But at the end of the day, this was a serious endeavor for me. That's all I can say. I can only speak for myself. I can tell you, I can speak on behalf of the staff. They weren't there just as an exercise either. Everything that was said was important.
Thank you.
Can I follow up to what?
Sure.
I think all of us commend the staff for diving in and doing the outreach. That's what staff wanted to do. That's what the commission wanted to see happen. And so I think that's commendable, and all of us commend you. But I was away for the entire outreach process. So I'm playing catch up, and I know I had my iPad with me on vacation, and I looked at the letters to the editor and some other things, and I guess while it's commendable to do outreach efforts, I have to agree with some of the other commissioner statements that just to say, well, we were there and we listened, and I'm new to the job and I'm a good guy and I want the community to know that I listened, I think that only goes so far, because I would have preferred to have today a summary of what the community's feedback was at those meetings. And I think that would help us do our job better, help us when it comes time for us to make recommendations to the City Council. We're sitting here in large part to be part of the dialogue with our wider community, not just staff. And so absolutely staff's to be commended for the job it did, but you're not giving us back. I think we should have seen the PowerPoint or the materials, the pie charts that you're referring to, the statistics. I think we should have seen at least a one-page summary of what the major concerns were. I don't think we should be needing to pull it out of the staff, asking, well, what were the top two concerns? I think that should have been in today's report. And that, I think, is something to learn forward for the future. And then also in terms of how we went about eliciting the community's response and how we did our outreach to get the people to those meetings. I think one of the commissioners said last meeting that I think many of us concurred that email blasts to our customers would have been a more effective way. And when we say, well, what have we learned from this, if we only have 24 or 27 people coming to our meetings, to me, as a commissioner, that suggests that we should move up our priority list of to-dos for the future. We should be, having somebody sit down and make a program, for how we're going to collect customers' email addresses and get their consent for that. That would have been an effective outreach method for getting people to the meetings. I was very critical of the flyers. I know that this was kind of put together really quickly, and I know we have people new on the job, we have people who are being laid off, so I understand that staff is stressed, but I saw those flyers published in the newspaper. If I hadn't been a commissioner, I wouldn't have known that those ads in the newspaper were about a potential rate increase. I mean, it was very hard to discern that from those ads, and I mentioned that last time. So to me, those are also things that we can learn for the future. Do better designed flyers in multiple languages, get email addresses, and get prepared to communicate more, with our public in a more time-efficient manner. So, and it would help the Commission do its job if we received the same materials that the public receives at the outreach. So you don't have to respond. I think those are things that are on the list for learning for the future. Thank you.
Any other comments? Okay, we do have a public speaker, Mr. Aram Kazazian.
Good afternoon. I guess I'm the only one speaking, today, maybe. I don't know. Okay, my name is Aram Kazazian. Number one, I just would like to comment on Martin Powers. He did a good job, but I do have one recommendation. Maybe next time, if he contacts me, I will bring you more people. There were a total of 22 people that were new from all those meetings, except the Armenian National Committee, which I didn't attend. The ones I counted, most of them were all the same people. But if you count all the new people, there was only 22 new people out of 180,000, 190,000 people in Glendale. So it's kind of disturbing because there are other ways to do we can bring. Now, number one item I'd like to go over that we do know that Glendale Water and Power in the last 10 years have transferred a total of $250 million into the Glendale General Fund, and the Glendale General Fund has transferred $315 million to the Glendale redevelopment.
Mr. Kazazian, we're going to be speaking to the transfer as another agenda item. This is strictly regarding outreach, so I would encourage you to hold your comments for the next item.
Okay, I can go with outreach you want, but that way I won't speak on outreach that way. I mean, I won't speak on the other one for you.
It's a Brown Act requirement, so if you could hold those comments till the next agenda item, please.
So, if you want me to do that, then I'll separate them. I'll need to put another card in then. Now, the best way to have done it, if somebody were to ask me, is especially in the Armenian community, which we have, I think, 80,000 or no, 60,000 Armenian community, would have been either the news, more stronger on newspapers and TV. A lot of them watch television. Television is one big issue there. We could have brought many more people into that. Also going into the Glendale Homeowners Coordinating Council, asking each of the different sections of the town, city, to be email bombarded out to a lot of different members of their own. That would have brought more people. And like the Commissioner Dentler said, the newspaper ad, you need to have more visibility to it. You could not see it. A lot of people just ignored it. They didn't understand what it was. I put out a flyer myself. My flyers put more people out awareness than the one Glendale did. So those are the things. So next time, if you want to do it, have Martin Power call me. You have my number, Martin, and I will show you how to get more. But he did a great job. What he did, what the timetable he had, and he was restrained. What he was told to do, he did what he could do with his best time efforts he had. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I have a comment about that.
comment as
Mr.
well.
President. Thank you, Mr. Zaki. If he mentioned that he can bring in people like Mr. Powell is doing a great job, maybe he can spread the word to bring the public to this commission meeting, because we always welcome more public participation in these meetings. If he can help us out with that, that would be great too.
Okay,
just one final comment about this issue. I think it's very easy to criticize efforts, and our job is somewhat to criticize, I guess, or to be skeptical and whatnot. But I think the utility did a good job for this effort, and more so, I think there's a certain point where you can reach out as much as you want. When people don't care about an issue, they're not going to attend. And I think after you put out an ad in 6-7 newspapers twice a week, or twice overall, and have a announcement on online, there's a certain point where if somebody doesn't care, even if they hear about it, they're just not going to attend. It doesn't get people riled up. And I think this may be an issue like that. So as we should obviously take every opportunity to learn, I think for this particular event or for this particular outreach, I commend the city in going out of its way, really, to put the word out there. And as Commissioner Yao mentioned, if people can bring other individuals to community meetings, this is a great venue, and so is every other outreach event that the city puts out. Thank you.
we have another couple of speakers on this agenda item. Mr. Harry Zavos.
My name is Harry Zavos. I'm a citizen in Glendale, and I'll be brief. At one time I heard a councilman take as a positive thing that during council meetings, very few people came to raise any criticisms. I had the opposite reaction. In a vibrant democracy, clearly on public issues, there can't be that kind of unanimity of opinion. And the failure of people to come, I think, bodes not well for a representative government. It reflects what one of the commissioners may have suggested, an apathetic citizenry. And an apathetic citizenry is not healthy to representative government. Now, I know what the basis for that is, but I think the people who come, and certainly not with this commission, but in some other public forums, to be treated in some ways with disrespect or to be ignored, tends to cause people to shrug their shoulders and say, what's the use? I commend this commission, the comments that you've made here about the need for vibrant debate, the public coming and expressing their points of view, and clearly I went to 3 of those meetings, and the representation for a city of this size was very, very minuscule, and whether that speaks poorly for the outreach program or whether that speaks poorly for the citizenry of this city, it's not a good thing.
Thank you, Mr. Zavos. Final speaker on this agenda item, Dennis DiPietro. Sorry if I didn't pronounce it properly.
Good evening, members of the Power Commission. My name is Dennis DiPietro, and I'm the chairman of the board of the Glendale Chamber of Commerce. And on behalf of the Chamber, I wanted to commend Mr. Zern and the other administrators of his department who came last week and spoke before the Advocacy Committee. I think it was very helpful. And I think Mr. Zern this afternoon expressed well the 2 issues that are on our minds, the transfer and also how rate increases will affect us in this really economy. We feel that business obviously provides an enormous benefit to the city, and it has much more constraints than other sectors of the city. And currently the Advocacy Committee and the board is putting together a formal position on this, obviously a little bit influenced by the timetable that's being determined by when it will go to the board in terms of a recommendation for any kind of change. So thank you very much for your time.
We appreciate you coming out on behalf of the Chamber. We always welcome your participation and look forward to hearing the views of the business community at future commission meetings as well. Appreciate you coming out. If there's no other comments, I just wanted to make one summary comment in my behalf, and that is two specific things. One is that I regard this effort that staff made as not the end but the beginning of this sort of process for important issues that affect all citizens and certainly all customers who pay the way for GWP. I hope that you will do that debrief session so that we can have learnings from this and how we can improve, as well as how we might better partner with community-based organizations so that the penetration into the community can be more. I do concur with Commissioner Jemian's comments that on some issues it's hard to get people out, but I think it's our responsibility, both as a commission as well as staff, to do everything we possibly can to get the word out and get people to take interest, particularly on utility and energy type of issues, which are going to be increasingly important issues for all cities and the state in terms of how we deal with complicated issues that require balancing acts from a policy perspective, because there are no black and white decisions in this area. So I think the more we can engage and educate the public on these issues, even when there isn't a specific proposal on the table, I think generally speaking, as a utility, if we can look to how we are going to continually educate the public and customers about issues in general, even without any specific proposals on the table, I think that will go a long way in creating a foundation for when there are proposals so that you have a baseline education out there. So just kind of utility 101 type of education, working with community-based organizations would, I think, benefit the utility for future policy-related questions that might come up. So thank you. Okay.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I do have an additional point to make. So I understand this presentation will go to City Council, and you mentioned earlier that depending on what Council decides, then we will either revisit the rate increase proposal or wait till next year or whenever, right? Okay, so I have a suggestion. When it's presented to the Council, maybe it'd be helpful to Council to have a list of projects or initiatives, okay, that would have to be deferred or eliminated due to this change, specifically ones that would impact safety, reliability, and customer service.
Excellent point.
Thanks.
Comments? Okay, next agenda item.
3B, overview of legal analysis regarding general fund transfer and Proposition 26. Christine Godinez.
I'm going to speak from here so that I can take a look at my PowerPoint. Mr. President and members of the GWP Commission, I'm Christine Godinez. I'm Senior Assistant City Attorney, and I'm here to present for you an overview of the City Attorney's legal opinion with regard to the transfer and the accounting methodology used by the City with respect to transferring funds from the electric fund to the general fund, and secondly, the issue of Proposition 26. As Mr. Zern indicated, there was a great deal of interest in this topic at the community meetings, and there were allegations made that the city is in violation of the charter and in violation of the California Constitution. These are allegations that our office does not take lightly. Our job is to obviously make sure that the city is in compliance with law. Also, if we are to go about doing a bond measure, it's incumbent on our office to issue a legal opinion indicating that there's no issue with regard to our compliance with law. So when it's alleged that we're in violation, it's something that, as I said, we take seriously. We investigate thoroughly. We did a detailed review of the law and our accounting practices, and we've presented an opinion to the City Council as well as presented it to the public. So today I just wanted to give you an overview of that. So there are two separate and distinct issues. There's the electric transfer, and there's Proposition 26, and sometimes these get confused. It's alleged that we're violating the Constitution because of our accounting practices. That's not the case. So I'm going to talk about these issues separately. The electric transfer relates to the manner in which we're complying with the city charter, the manner in which we're transferring money within one account within the Glendale Water and Power accounts to the city's general fund. So that's topic number one of my presentation. The second topic is Proposition 26. That's a California constitutional provision that is really a game changer as far as how one goes about doing rate increases, including electric rate increases. And because there's a transfer component to our rates, Prop 26 is potentially implicated, and so that's another issue that we've been investigating. Okay, so next slide. So I do apologize. I have a number of detailed slides regarding accounting and how the accounts are set up within GWP, and they are not fascinating. So I'm going to start with my conclusions before I put you to sleep. With regard to the transfer, it's the city attorney's conclusion that the city's accounting practices are compliant with the charter. There's one area where we've identified the need for the city to change its practices, and that's with regard to the timing of the transfer. Up until this point, the city has been doing the transfer in monthly increments, transferring 1/12 of the transfer amount throughout the fiscal year. In fact, the transfer says that it should be done at the end of the fiscal year, and so we've recommended to the city that this take place, and that's going to be implemented.
Can you explain why the charter says that?
Well, that's the specific wording in the charter. I'm not certain what the intent was behind that provision. I can tell you as a general matter that the accounting provisions in the charter are quite out of date, and if you consider modern accounting practices with technology and generally accepted accounting principles of today, it would be more prudent to do it on a monthly basis for a cash flow, from a cash flow perspective. But because that's not what the charter says, we've recommended that it take place at the end of the year.
So the charter specifically says at the end, transfer at the end of the year.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So that's our conclusion with respect to the transfer. With respect to Proposition 26, it's our conclusion that the existing rate structure is compliant with Proposition 26 and that the proposed rate increase does not need to go out to a vote of the public. So let me start with the electric fund transfer. The legal issue is essentially, is the city properly transferring funds from the Electric Works Revenue Fund to the general fund? So stated otherwise, are the city's accounting practices compliant with the charter? And before I get into the legal analysis, I just want to briefly give you an overview of the funds that the charter calls for. There are four. There's the Electric Works Revenue Fund, the Depreciation Fund, the Sinking Fund, and the Surplus Fund. Those are the four GWP funds. Next slide. So starting with the Electric Works Revenue Fund, it essentially functions as the electric department's checking account. This is where money goes in from electric rates. It's where money goes out to pay for the budgeted obligations of the electric department, except for depreciation, which comes out of the depreciation fund. At the end of the year, any balance remaining in that account gets transferred to the surplus fund. Next is the depreciation fund. Okay, so the money to this fund comes in from the Electric Works Revenue Fund. And what it says is the council shall annually set aside from the income of Glendale Water and Power a fund which, according to the estimates of the city manager, shall be sufficient to meet the normal depreciation of the electric works. And I've got this wording in bold because this pertains to one of the allegations that's made against the city with respect to this fund. There's an allegation, which I'll detail later, that the city is not sufficiently funding this account. And in connection with that, I've included the definition of depreciation. This is the standard accounting definition of the term, which I want you to remember as we get into the allegations. Depreciation is the allocation of the historical cost of a capital asset throughout its useful life.
So, I'm sorry, I'm going to ask questions along the way because I think it'll help because it's going to be a complicated presentation. So, in terms of where capital projects are funded from, does it come out of this Electric Works Revenue Fund?
It can come out of various sources. If it's budgeted, it can come out of the Electric Works Revenue Fund. It can be paid out of the Depreciation Fund. It can be paid by bond revenue, or it could also be paid by special appropriation out of the Surplus Fund.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so as I said, the inflow, where the money comes from, is from that Electric Works Revenue Fund. The outflow, so getting to your question, the funds that go into this depreciation account shall only be used for the repair, replacement, betterment, and extension of the plants and equipment of the Electric Works. That section also says, nothing herein contained shall limit the right to vote and issue bonds. So bonding for capital improvements is perfectly acceptable as well. Okay, so the next fund is the sinking fund. The sinking fund, the money would go into this fund from the Electric Works Revenue Fund, and this is for payment of debt service, payment for principal and interest on bonds. The city currently does not maintain a sinking fund, and the reason for this is because it was deemed to be superfluous under accounting practices. We can track the amount that we're paying for debt service through the Electric Works Revenue Fund. And in this section of the charter, it actually allows for payments to come from the Electric Works Revenue Fund for payment of debt service. So that's currently the practice that we're implementing. If you look at the next slide, this is the wording in the charter regarding the sinking fund. And if you see the bold language, it says, nothing in this section shall impair the power of the council to pay from the Electric Works Revenue Fund the principal and interest of any general obligation bonds of the city hereafter issued for electric works purposes. That's in fact what the city does. It pays for debt service out of the Electric Works Revenue Fund. Okay, so getting to the fourth fund, it's the surplus fund.
Sorry, so the general obligation bonds, where it says at the very end that you've bolded, meaning just general GWP related or anything within the city?
GWP related. You could not pay for a general municipal bond out of this fund. So you see it talks about for electric works purposes.
Okay.
Yeah. I know that language is a little confusing.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so the surplus fund, the money that goes into the surplus fund comes from the Electric Works Revenue Fund. I told you when we were talking about that Electric Works Revenue Fund that any balance remaining at the end of the year gets shifted into the surplus fund. That's what the charter requires. That's what the city does. There's two sections in the charter that speak to this, Section 22 and Section 20 of Article 11 of the charter. So it says that a surplus fund is hereby created, and into that account goes any amounts in excess of the requirements of the several funds as heretofore set forth. And in Section 20, which is the section dealing with the Electric Works Revenue Fund, it says the credit balance, if any, or any part thereof, in excess of the amounts of all outstanding demands and liabilities unpaid from said account on account of budget appropriations therefrom shall be transferred to the surplus fund. So the excess, the surplus at the end of each year goes into the surplus fund. Okay, because the surplus fund is an important fund, this is the transfer fund, I want to talk a little bit more about it. So that was the inflow to the surplus fund. This is the outflow, how money goes out of that fund. There are two ways. The first, as we mentioned before, you could make a special appropriation from the surplus fund to pay for capital projects, for electric works purposes. That's one way. The second way money goes out of this fund is through the transfer, the famous transfer. So let's talk about the transfer. This is the wording in the charter, Article 11, Section 22, that speaks to the transfer. It says, at the end of each fiscal year, an amount equal to 25% of the operating revenues of the Department of GWP for such year, excluding receipts from water and power supplied to other cities or utilities at wholesale, shall be transferred from the surplus fund to the general reserve fund. And then there's a method to reduce that amount annually at or before the time for adopting the general budget for the year, or to waive the transfer wholly if, in the opinion of the City Council, such reduction or waiver is necessary to ensure the sound financial position of the GWP Department. And to do so, the City Council would so declare by resolution. And this, in fact, takes place every year, at least every year that I've been aware of in recent history. The City Council has reviewed the transfer, and each year, during the same City Council meeting that it adopts the budget, it adopts a resolution reducing the transfer to an amount that is below the 25%.
Quick question before you move on. The wording 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines down about the general reserve fund. And that came up at our meeting last time, and I wondered if you're going to get to that today or give us an opinion about that another day. There was an additional allegation that there should be a separate fund called the reserve fund, whereas the public thinks of this transfer as going into the general fund. It's kind of a sidebar issue.
Yeah, and I do view that as a sidebar, particularly with respect to this commission, because I think that's not really within the scope of this commission. I will say that I think that's a red herring. There's really no issue there, but I'll reserve that for the discussion at City Council because they'll be taking this up in 2 weeks' time.
That's fine. I just wondered if it's coming to us in today's presentation. That's fine. Thank you.
Okay, so let's get to those allegations regarding what the city is allegedly doing wrong. And I've done my best to characterize these arguments. I hope I'm not misstating them. I'm sure I'll be corrected if I am, and I'm happy to respond, but this is the best we understand what the arguments are. Allegation number 1 is that the city is not putting enough money into that depreciation fund. We're not adequately funding the depreciation fund. Allegation 2, that the transfer rate should be applied to the surplus, that you shouldn't be transferring any more than 25% of the surplus that gets transferred into the GWP surplus fund. Allegation number 3, that the transfer amount cannot be budgeted because you only transfer the surplus amount into the surplus fund and you can't budget for a surplus. And allegation number 4, that the transfer should take place at the end of the year. So with regard to the first allegation regarding the depreciation fund, the allegation is that the city is not sufficiently funding this fund. We're not setting aside sufficient money to fund capital projects. But if you look at what I described earlier as a definition in accounting of what depreciation is, it's the allocation of the historical cost of an asset, of a capital asset over its useful life. So for example, if you were to take a transformer, and the city were to purchase it today, let's say it costs $500,000 to buy that transformer in today's dollars, and you look at what the economic cost of that asset is, or the economic lifespan of that asset, the historical value of that asset, it's going to go out for, let's say, 20 years. So you divide that $500,000 by 20, and that's the amount of money that would get put each year into that depreciation fund. You're funding the value of that depreciation over time. The allegation is that, in fact, the city should look to the future value of what things are going to cost in the future, and that fund the normal depreciation means put enough money so that if we need to buy a transformer 10, 15, 20 years from now, we're putting aside what the cost will be in the future. But that's not what depreciation means. And when we look at a statute or a provision of a charter, we have to apply the plain meaning. We can't give a constricted or tortured or unusual meaning to a word when we've got a plain meaning on the face of the charter. And so the city interprets the depreciation just as it says, just as the accounting term is applied, and it uses a historical value as the basis for depreciation. Additionally, if you look at the wording in that section, it talks about bond funding as an alternative means to fund capital improvements. And if you were to interpret this section as just requiring you to fully fund future capital projects through this fund, it reads out that wording about bonding and other methods of funding such projects.
If I could ask a question here, Mr. Zern, just to stick to the points that we're talking about it at the same time. So if that's not the way the depreciation funding mechanism, let's say, is used, how do you plan for the ultimate replacement? How do you, from an accounting perspective, how do you plan for major elements of the system to make sure that we have adequate funding in the future?
Mr. President, that is done for the most part through the capital improvement project budget. That is where significant infrastructure is the upkeep of significant infrastructure is taken care of, whether it's the power plant or the distribution system.
And how many years out do you look at that sort of thing so that you're planning for those sorts of major cost items?
Generally 5 years. In some cases we can look out further, but as you may well know, things change dramatically. So what I found to be beneficial is you have a 5-year plan and you hone that each year, so at about year 3 you've got a really good idea, and you may be moving the components around within that, but 5 years is a good planning tool for the capital infrastructure.
And are you starting, from the finance perspective, are you starting to figure out the funding for those 5 years out?
At a minimum, yes, yes. And if we have larger projects that we see on the horizon, let's say there's something out there that we know is lingering in 10 years, we may even start that process ahead of time. But certainly we're putting the funding together, and as we look at each year, and I've said before, this $25 to $30 million a year in capital infrastructure in the electric fund, we've got those projects within there, we've got them costed out, and we've got those plugged in to future budgets.
So you're starting to save for it?
Well,
depending on how big the project is.
Correct. And you always, as you begin to budget that, you compare it to what your available resources are, and then if you have to make adjustments within that, you do that.
So you start thinking about ahead of time, like how you're going to pay for that, whether it's by saving up for it, as a normal person would do, just to put it in simplistic terms, or whether you're going to acquire debt to pay for it.
That is correct. That is correct.
Thank you.
Okay, so moving on to the second allegation. This relates to the 25% transfer rate, and what do you apply that to? The allegation is that, really there shouldn't be any surplus at all because you've got all these obligations in the electric fund, so really you don't have anything to transfer. And how can you be transferring more than 25% of the surplus? And our response is that the city is compliant with the requirements of the charter, and that the proposed method of transferring 25% of the surplus is not what the charter wording says. That would be inconsistent with the wording in the charter. So let's look at the wording in the charter. Here again is that famous wording regarding the transfer. If you look at the bold wording, it says, at the end of each fiscal year, an amount equal to 25% of the operating revenues of the Department of GWP for such year, excluding receipts from water and power supplied to other cities or utilities at wholesale rates. That's what gets transferred. 25% of the operating revenues. What are operating revenues? Operating revenues is gross revenue. It's not revenue minus expenses. It's not electric works fund minus all the other obligations. It's gross revenue. The only thing that the charter says that we deduct from that 25% calculation is receipts from water or power supplied to other cities or utilities at wholesale rate, so wholesale revenue. When you're interpreting a charter provision and it has an explicit carve-out, you can't read other carve-outs into the wording if they're just not there. That's a basic principle of statutory construction. So we have to look at the language and take it at face value that when it says 25% of operating revenues less just the wholesale, that's in fact what it means.
Where is operating revenues defined as gross?
That's just a general principle of accounting. If you look at any standard definition of operating revenue, that's the plain meaning of that term.
So, again, because these are so complicated, and the terminology, and most people are not familiar with, when you say standard accounting terminology, it might be, just as a suggestion, it might be helpful when you do the same presentation to council to have some citations or standard references so that time isn't taken up with questions like mine. Where is that defined as gross? And so it reduces, debate about, well, where did you come up with that? I would suggest that.
Yeah, and it's included in my, our written opinion of our office. I will add that and make sure that's added for City Council.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. What comes into the surplus fund? This is different than what goes out. We looked at these provisions before. This is the inflow into the surplus fund. So Section 22, which is the famous transfer provision, and Section 20, which is the Electric Works Revenue Fund provision. Again, what goes in is the surplus remaining at the end of the year. So any amounts in excess of the requirements of the several funds hereinbefore set forth. And the credit balance, if any, or any part, at the end of the fiscal year. That's what gets transferred into the surplus fund, but that's not the same as the amount that the charter calls to be transferred out. So inflow into the surplus fund is not the same as operating revenues, which again was a measure of, it's a gross revenue amount. So to summarize, with respect to this allegation, the allegation is incorrect. The transfer is 25% of the operating revenues of GWP, excluding only that wholesale rate revenue. Operating revenues is gross revenue, and the outflow from the fund is not the same as what goes into the fund. So moving on, unless there are questions, to the next allegation.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
To back up to.
Sure.
When you said it was in the opinion, are you referring to the Government Financial Officers Association?
I am.
Thanks, okay. Just trying to make sure I'm on the same page with you and your thinking. Thank
Understood.
you.
Allegation number 3 relates to the budgeting of the transfer. Now, the transfer, the allegation is that the transfer can't be budgeted because the charter only allows the transfer of surplus money into the surplus fund. So this, again, is, I think, tied up with the confusion about what goes into the fund and what goes out of the fund. And the response from the city, based on our analysis, is that as part of the budget planning process, the city can and probably should continue to anticipate and budget for the transfer as part of its budget planning process. It's a cost to the utility. And the city does not budget for a surplus. It budgets for the transfer. When you look at the transfer, and that famous transfer provision, we've looked at it a couple times, it says the city shall transfer. It's a mandatory obligation that a transfer occur at the end of the fiscal year. Additionally, if you look at Article 11, Section 6, and in the packet of materials that I've provided to you, as well as there are copies in the back of the room, there are excerpts from the charter that contain this language. That section compels the city manager to include in his budget estimates of the revenue and expenditures of the city department. So with the understanding that the transfer is a mandatory requirement of the utility, it would be imprudent not to budget for a transfer as part of the budget planning process. Allegation number 4 is that the transfer should take place at the end of the fiscal year. And the response is that's absolutely correct. The Article 11, Section 22 specifically says the transfer shall take place at the end of the fiscal year. As I said, it's been the city's practice to do it on a monthly basis because from a cash flow perspective, that just makes better financial sense. But based on the plain wording of the charter, it's our recommendation that the city implement a transfer at the end of the year, and the city finance department is in agreement, and that's what they will be doing. So that concludes the presentation regarding transfer. And before I dive into Prop 26, I wanted to stop and see if there are any questions about the transfer before I move on.
I have one. Are there any other city departments that transfer funds to the general fund?
Yes, there are. I believe the sewer department, sewer refuse and parking also do transfers.
And are they, if you know, it may not be within the scope of the analysis that you've done for us for today's presentation, but if you do know, does the city manager, does the city budget for those transfers? And are there any ways in which the process of budgeting for the GWP transfer, does that process, or has that process historically varied from, say, the sewer transfer or the other fund transfers, parking, et cetera?
I don't know that. That's not something I investigated as part of this presentation for today.
I have a question. Slide 13, definition of the transfer. Towards the bottom of that definition, it says, at or before the time for adopting the general budget for the general budget for the ensuing fiscal year, reduce said amount or wholly waive such transfer if, in its opinion, such reduction of waiver is necessary to ensure the sound financial position of said department. Sound financial position is, I guess, what I'm honing on to, is having the reserves of the department so low. Question needs to be asked is, if your reserves are low and if you have a certain accidents or situations come up, wouldn't one look at this and say that the department may not have sound financial position as of today? And so, meaning, this definition says if that is the case, then the transfer can be either reduced or completely waived.
correct, and that's within the discretion of the city council. So they take a look at it, and I don't know if you were present or paid attention to the June 26th meeting, but they did undergo an analysis where they took a look at what the financial ratings are currently of the utility, and they did, weigh the pros and cons of doing the transfer, and based on their evaluation, they reduced the transfer amount below 25%. But they do undertake that analysis. It doesn't, you'll notice there's nothing in there that guides their determination. It just says sound financial position.
It's vague, right.
So if someone were to take a look at that and maybe want to take them up on that and say, how could you make that determination given the state of the utility? And if they were to challenge that, a court would look at it, and determine, did they abuse their discretion? Were they acting in a manner that was what's called arbitrary and capricious? Was there absolutely no evidence to support what they decided in that regard? There's a fairly deferential standard, but they do have to be reasonable in that determination.
Sure. The point I wanted to bring up, that definition is obviously very vague in the charter, and also that it's the council decision and not this commission's to decide whether the department is, of sound financial position or not.
Correct.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yes, a few comments. I'd just like to preface this that this is a legal analysis, and I guess different people would interpret it differently. And I do agree with the transfer law, by the way. But I just want to make a comparison to the intent of this charter. I think just from my personal view, that I think the frame of the charter got it to the point where it's vague enough and it's flexible enough for us to determine, just like a constitution. But I think that they were business people back then too. And as a business owner, even for apartment owner, just an example, if you get revenue from rent, a smart landlord owner would want to set aside different funds to, for example, let's go with those 4 funds so I can track those. The electric revenues fund would be an example of a rental income. And then the depreciation fund would be a fund that would set aside to replace or repair, let's say, refrigerators, washing machines, so that it's going to get broken every year. So you want to set aside that depreciation fund for that replacement purposes. And number 3 is the sinking fund, which is the mortgage payment. You're going to pay a mortgage, the principal and interest, so you want to set aside that you have enough from the rental income to pay for the mortgage and for the taxes, etc. And then the 4th one is the surplus fund. In this example, from the building owner perspective, would be anything that would be net from the revenue. You subtract out the depreciation fund you set aside and the principal and mortgage payment you set aside. And so that surplus fund, I would assume, as a business person, that would go towards a fund that you would use for your profit. So additional profit can be made if your other funds are being covered. Then from that profit fund, which is the surplus fund, I assume, will be used to go back into the shareholder or the owner's pocket, or to be given away, or maybe if it's so much that they can give back to the renters, even though it's not likely. But I would assume that's the case for any surplus fund, that's the discretion and the option of the owner landlord, in this case the city and the city council, to decide what to do with that surplus fund. But like any building owner, if the revenue doesn't cover or just covers the depreciation fund and the sinking fund to pay your mortgage and principal, then there wouldn't be any excess surplus fund for profit. So therefore, I would assume in this case that the city council, if there's no surplus fund in the surplus, as a profit in the surplus fund, then there wouldn't be any transfer. Even though I agree that potentially it should be budgeted, because like any investor-owned utilities, there is an obligation of the utility to provide revenue for the shareholders, in this case, the public of the city, the citizens of the city. And so I support that perspective from the city council to budget those transfer in the operating revenue. So from that perspective, I think we can transfer it, but I assume that the framer of this charter had that idea in mind, that the depreciation fund should be adequately funded so that you can repair and replace refrigerators, washing machines, as an example, from the building owner, and then, of course, the principal and mortgage payments. So that's all I'm going at, is that I do support the transfer, but I think that we have to look at it from that perspective, that there are certain funds that are designed to cover what a business person would normally see. So hopefully we get to that point where we minimize the discussion on what transfer, why we're doing this or that, but I think we just have to know that these funds should be adequately funded and the transfer should still take place, but it should be taking place knowing exactly what is being done and how those revenues should be going to pay for these different products and services that the utility offers.
Other questions? I have a couple. So on slide 18, I want to continue with Commissioner Yao's statement, because I think the question at this point is not just, is it legal or is it not legal to transfer? I think the questions and what we're facing as a dilemma is, over the years, what have been the more subjective judgments that have been made by deciding bodies in balancing the needs of the utility versus the needs of the city with the general fund. And now with a bad economy, we have our backs against the wall a little bit, where the utility needs funds to do a variety of projects and is having to go back to customers to get those additional funds. If you look at some of the issues with regard to the surplus fund and the depreciation fund, if you were looking at those funds a little bit more conservatively over the years, knowing what a capital-intensive business it is to maintain a utility, you would have been more conservative in the amounts that you would have transferred out of the utility versus what you would have kept in as part of your funding mix for future CapEx. So, for example, on this particular slide, we talk about, the credit balance, if any, in each of these said funds at the end of the fiscal year, the amount of which is in excess of the amount of all outstanding demands and liabilities. Again, some of the devil is in the details of the definition of what are the outstanding demands and liabilities, not just in that year, but in coming years for the utility, which might define how much money you reserve within GWP to fund those sorts of things. Same with, if we go back to slide 8, the depreciation fund. This is potentially one of the funds from which you would be funding important capital expenditures, but have we been reserving enough funds within this fund to, again, plan for future expenditure needs? And I think we've backed up over the years of depleting our capacity as a utility to fund moving forward. So I guess it's more of a statement than a question, because I think that with all these funds, if judgment were applied in a somewhat more objective way, and if the GWP staff over the years had advocated more vigorously about maintaining some discipline of what's maintained within GWP in these various funds, because of, again, looking forward and the needs of the GWP to maintain kind of the integrity of the operation, I think, perhaps past city councils might have been a little bit more conservative. But I fear what has happened over time is that whenever there's been a budget shortfall, one of the ways we tend to make it all balance out is by transferring more at moving funds around within the city and making that balanced budget appear. But now that revenues are lower and times are tighter, we're in this predicament of now we've kind of depleted the bank account, if you will, and now have to go back to the shareholders to say, give up, deposit more money in the bank account, please, so that we can maintain the operation properly. So, I think part of the lesson here is, aside from the debate here about, is transfer legal or is transfer not legal, is the issue of how much does GWP kind of advocate in behalf of GWP, even though it's part of the same city. At the same time, the first responsibility of GWP staff is to ensure that you're advocating for maintaining the integrity of the system, including kind of looking ahead and what are the needs going to be coming up. And maybe it goes even beyond the 5-year mark, and it should be even further than that because it's such a capital-intensive business so that we don't find ourselves in these situations. Because at the end of the day, the argument needs to be supported when you go back to the public and the people paying the bills, that you did everything you could to plan for these major CapEx needs. And if we said, well, sorry, we haven't really saved enough for this, and so our choices are two, right? Bond or raise rates so that we can increase the revenue coming in. And I think that's should be part of the discussion when you go to council, is this starting this conversation about moving forward. We really need to be very judicious about how much we transfer, where the first priority needs to be maintaining the integrity of the system so that we're not depleting it. Then we can look at where else we might spread some of the revenue to cover other needs as well in the city. Because if the system falls apart, then everything falls apart in the city.
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah.
I thought that both of your remarks were really excellent, and I appreciated listening to you. And I think that both of the commissioners have articulated things that members of the public are feeling, and that while something may be legally defensible, and we really appreciate the work, the research, the analysis, I know this is just an information item. We're not adopting your analysis. You're just sharing it with us. And so I can tell that you've done a lot of work to make this legally defensible, and I hope it is, and I appreciate understanding the analysis. But then there's the secondary thing, which you've just heard. With that in mind, this question occurs to me. Is there, from the city attorney's point of view, your professional duty is to the city as a whole, as to the city as one entity. If I understand the way the assignments work in the city attorney's office, you happen to be assigned to be the legal advisor to the GWP, correct?
That's correct.
Are you the legal advisor to the GWP and also to the GWP Commission?
Well, I do advise this commission, as you know. Technically, my client is the city of Glendale, but I specifically represent Glendale Water and Power.
So it strikes me that there's something, I don't want to call it a conflict of interest, that's putting it too, that's going too far. But I just wondered if you could share with us any thoughts you have about the fact that really the city attorney is defending on behalf of the city as an entity. Really, your professional obligation is to defend the transfer, essentially, because that's a decision of the city to protect its general fund. But you're here today in your capacity as legal advisor to this particular department. And it's just occurring to me, listening to the dialogue, that because it kind of seems like there should be an independent attorney on this matter, because don't you have some conflict in the two duties?
No, I don't think so, and let me explain why. My role as an attorney in general is to provide a truthful outlook of the way I see the law, the good and the bad. And if you'll recall back to when this commission and the city council was considering the issue of Proposition 218, our office came out with an opinion that, in fact, that transfer needed to be discontinued. Very bad for the city, potentially good for Glendale Water and Power, but our job and our role is to provide an impartial analysis. So we need to present the risks to the city as well as what we consider to be accurate. So I could not come before you today and present to you what I think is, an inaccurate version of the law. I mean, that would be potentially malpractice. So I need to come before you and tell you the law as I see it, and that's what I've done. That's what I'll continue to do.
Absolutely. I understand that. It's just occurring to me, I think what what I said maybe wasn't as clear as it could be, and maybe I'll talk to you about it another time, or send you an email. I didn't mean cast any aspersions on how you're advising your client. I'm just noting that your client is the city, and its general fund is what your client draws from to operate itself as an entity. And then over here we have a utility that needs potentially to raise revenues to pay for its operations. To some extent, it's inherent in your performance of your duty to the city as your client to defend the transfer of the general fund.
And there's no question there's a tension between the departments in this case. I mean, not everyone's going to end up happy with this result. But, the charge to me was look at this issue and is it legal? It wasn't, do your best to find that this transfer is legal because the city darn well needs this money. It was take an impartial look at this, research it thoroughly, and give us your opinion. And that's what I, in conjunction with Mike Garcia, the city attorney, have done.
Well, that's why I think from a legal analysis perspective, part of the issue is just the very objective analysis, but then part of it, some of the terminology. I'm not a lawyer, but but based on the terminology that exists in the charter, I think could be interpreted subjectively based upon who's interpreting it. And that's not to say to the point of it making something that we're doing today from legal to illegal, but I think in terms of the judgment that it suggests in terms of how we manage some of these funds, I think there's two ways to interpret it. There's is it legal? Are we okay? How far can we, push this within the bounds of it being legal? And then there's the way, well, what's prudent to do in terms of protecting the interests and the sound operations of GWP. And I think while we look at it all as one city and GWP is part of the city at the same time, I think there is a need for GWP to be able to advocate without any retribution the sound management of the utility and advocating that a certain amount of funds be reserved. And I think part of the challenge is an operation like GWP, a lot of it is long-term capital spending. And so it's very easy and tempting to adopt a kick the can down the road type of budgeting process by a city, and then a future city council will have to deal with the consequences. Well, at the end of the day, there's eventually an end to that road where the bills come due, and that's kind of the situation we're in today. So, I would hope from a philosophical perspective and a culture perspective that both city council as well as city management and city manager would consider a little bit of this dilemma that GWP staff need to have the room to advocate in behalf of the sound management of the utility if that's the business we're going to be in, which requires saving appropriately in the variety of funds which serve as funding mechanisms for some of these major things.
And, the city manager has come and spoken to this commission as well as before council. As you know, his goal is to reduce that transfer over time. And it's not, a light switch that goes off right away, but it's definitely his goal as well. So, yeah.
Mr. President, members of the commission, maybe I can just make a couple of comments, being as I come from the general fund side, the enterprise fund side. I have most of the other enterprise funds in the city and now involved in Glendale Water and Power. The job that the city council has to do and the decisions they have to make and the city manager are tremendous, especially in these economic times. That same philosophy that you were mentioning about the folks within GWP advocating for their operation is what every one of us does in every one of our operations, whether you're the police chief, the fire chief, or the library director. You're advocating for your operation and saying where we can do without and where we need to draw the line, and at least giving council that information so that they can make that decision. I can tell you on the public works side, we've had to make a lot of sacrifices in the capital infrastructure area. we're going through that now in GWP as well. But I think as a whole, and one of the goals I have is to try to get the thinking of the utility to be more in line with the city. We're all one city. The council is responsible for all of those operations, and the city manager is responsible ultimately for managing those operations. But just to add that we go through that, each and every one of us in all of our operations, and I can tell you that there's some strong advocacy for operations and programs and budgets within each one. And I think, as I mentioned at one of the community outreach meetings, you know, there's a sense that this transfer is somehow keeping the general fund up and wealthy and healthy beyond at the expense of this utility and maybe other operations. We just got finished cutting $15 million out of the general fund. It was a painful exercise. It was painful for the council. It certainly was painful for all of us as executives to have to go through that, because it was staffing that was primarily hit. So I just thought I'd add that from my perspective, being both within the utility now and outside the utility. It's an exercise we all go through, and there's a tremendous amount of advocacy for your personal needs and issues. Again, I'm new to this. I'm not using that as an excuse, but I certainly intend, as I get more conversant and up to speed on what's happening in the utility, to make the changes necessary so that we do position ourselves to be much healthier financially in the future, whether that's, as I've said to each of you, I think individually, and I've said it publicly, is the cuts that we need to make and the cost reductions we need to make and the changes in philosophy and the way we do business that we have to make. It's a new norm for us in the utility as well as the city as a whole. So those are all things that we need to kind of bring together. And as Ms. Godina said, I think there's a great concern on the part of the council and the city manager. We're making some inroads into reducing the transfer. It's not a lot, but we're doing it a little bit here. Maybe we'll get a bigger bite next year, and so on. So I just thought I'd share that, because it isn't in isolation that the utility is facing these, but all of us facing these, and certainly the council. I've been involved in the budget sessions and with the council. They're looking at the city as a whole and the good of the city as a whole. And during these times, it is really, really tough and tough decisions that have to be made to see where we cut, where we don't cut, who gets it, who doesn't get it, who gets it more, and who gets it less. So,
everything you just said, I accept and appreciate. I understand that perspective, and I accept what you're saying. I think honing in on the language of slide 13 is what some of us are struggling with, in that it will be up to now you as interim, with the input from your legal advisor and whoever else weighs in on the decision, to tell City Council Sunday, maybe not this year, but in years to come, whether, quote, to reduce said amount of the transfer if, in its opinion, such reduction or waiver is necessary to ensure sound financial position of the Department of GWP. So I think we're kind of wondering who exactly within the city comes up with that opinion, because the City Council doesn't just come up with it on its own. And it seems to me that it's the proper purview of the general manager, with the advice of other staff and upon advice of legal counsel, to come up on an annual basis with a, quote, opinion as to whether the utility can be in a sound financial position at the end of each year when this transfers. So this is an educational process that we're all going through, and I think it's part of the Commission's role. I guess, I'm not sure, if we keep saying, well, we don't have jurisdiction over the transfer, but we do have jurisdiction over what the basis of the opinion of the soundness of the financial position of the utility is. So it strikes me, not with casting any aspersions on everyone's trying in the best professional way to do their jobs, but there are multiple hats, so that we're now, you are heading a a entity that produces surplus revenues, at least on paper, and also another entity which is a general fund entity. And one thing I was curious about tonight was the answer to my question. It sounds like it's yes, that the other department you head also transfers money to the general fund, which I didn't know before tonight. So it's helpful for me to fill in, get the total picture of where the transfers into the general fund come from. And so we're all learning. I do think that there are some tensions about even just the nature of the professional advice or the basis of the general manager's opinion when you have to give your opinion this time next year to council. So my comments aren't really, don't need answers.
Okay, let's move, in interest of time, let's move to the next part of the presentation.
Okay. Full disclosure, I have 20 more slides, so I'll try and whip through these.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. That's in the discretion of the president. This is set up as one presentation.
Yeah, it's one agenda item, so comments will have to wait till the end.
Okay, so Proposition 26. All right, so here's what I'm going to tell you. I'm going to give you an overview of Proposition 26. I'm going to explain how this relates to the proposed electric rate increase in conjunction with the transfer, and I'm going to establish to you that the city is in compliance with this constitutional provision. So what are the legal issues? Are the current electric rates in violation of Proposition 26? And is the proposed electric rate subject to Prop 26's voting requirements? You can hit the. Those are our answers. We're done.
We're done, yeah.
Okay, let me give you a very brief overview. Oh, we're just getting to the good part. Let me give you a brief overview of Proposition 26. So this was a voter-approved amendment to the California Constitution. Went into effect November 3rd of 2010. What it did was it amended 2 of the articles of the California Constitution that relate to taxes. And what it did is it greatly expanded what is considered a tax. So as we look at implementing a potential rate increase, why do we care? Because if something is considered a tax, you can't extend it, impose it, or increase it unless you put it out to a public vote. And in this case, it would be a 2/3 vote of the public that would be required in order to do a rate increase if the rate increase is considered a tax. So there are 2 reasons why the vote requirement does not apply to the proposed electric rate increase. 1 is because it is grandfathered, and 2 is because the electric rate increase falls within an exception to the definition of tax in this section of the Constitution. So let's look at the grandfathering issue really quickly first. The effective date, as I said, is November 3rd, 2010. So any rates that were in effect as of that date, November 3rd, 2010, are grandfathered, not subject to the voting requirements and the other requirements of Proposition 26. With respect to local governments, Prop 26 looks forward only. It doesn't look at previous rates. It's not retroactive. That's different than state measures. State fee increases are retroactive under Proposition 26, but not local measures like ours. So therefore, our current rate structure is not subject to Proposition 26. In fact, the transfer amount was approved by the voters in 1941 and then again in 1949. 1941, just by background, it was a 12% transfer, and then in 49 it got increased to 25%. Okay, so what triggers Proposition 26? It's whenever you extend, impose, or increase rates after November 3rd, 2010. So what does that mean? When does that kick in? So we look to something called the Proposition 218 Omnibus Implementation Act, which defines these terms for us. Impose is pretty straightforward. That's when you establish a new tax. Extend is when you extend the period of a tax, like if it's got a sunset provision, you extend it beyond that. Increase is one of 2 things. It's when you increase the applicable rate or where you change the methodology for calculating the rate. So either of those would be an increase in the tax. Okay, so now what is a tax? A tax under Proposition 26 is any levy, charge, or exaction of any kind imposed by a local government. There are 7 exceptions to that, and if you fall within an exception, then it's not considered a tax. And Proposition 26 places the burden on the public agency to establish that it's not a tax. So the burden's on us to prove it's not a tax. Okay, so the second of the 7 exceptions applies to electric rate increases. The exception is a charge imposed for a specific government service or product provided directly to the payer that is not provided to those not charged and which does not exceed the reasonable costs to the local government of providing the service or product. So if you fall within this exception, don't need a vote because it's not a tax. So you can increase the electric rates without a vote. So we need to take a close look at this language because it's definitely a mouthful and it's got a lot in it. The first part of the exception says a charge imposed for a specific government service or product provided directly to the payer. Okay, so I think we can check this one off because we've got an electric rate, it's clearly a product, electricity, and we're providing it directly to the payer, our ratepayers. So that section is met. Looking at the next clause, that is not provided to those not charged. One issue that's been raised, which we don't disagree with, is that the city has been funding its street lights and its traffic signals out of its electric rate revenue. So if the city were to go ahead and increase its electric rate, that becomes suspect under Proposition 26 because that is not, it's arguably you're providing a service to those not charged. People that aren't ratepayers are getting the benefits of those street lights and those traffic signals. So it's our recommendation to the city that if the city were to proceed with an electric rate increase, it cannot fund that portion through rate revenue. It would have to be funded through non-rate revenue, i.e. wholesale sales or something of that nature, but cannot be funded from electric rates.
Without a vote.
Without a 2/3 vote, yeah. Okay, so looking at the third part of the exception, which does not exceed the reasonable costs to the local government of providing the service or product. Okay, so we're kind of circling back to the issues we were talking about with the transfer. So the argument is if you've got an electric rate and part of your electric rate is this mandatory transfer that you're transferring for fire, police, libraries, public works, are you in fact charging the reasonable costs to the local government of providing electricity, or are you charging something more? If you're charging something more, you need to go out for a vote because you're no longer within this exception. By illustration, I want to discuss with you the only case that's out there right now on this issue, which is a case out of the city of Reading. And it is a trial court decision at this point. It's the only case, as I said, out there. It will no doubt be appealed. So we don't have the final word on this, but this is the best word we have right now. The City of Reading case was based on an electric rate increase that went into effect shortly after Proposition 26 went into effect. So a month later, there was an electric rate measure that went to the City Council in the City of Reading. Like Glendale, City of Reading has a transfer as a component of their requirements for their utility. So ratepayers challenged it and said, wait a minute, you needed to take this out to a vote because your rates exceed the reasonable cost of service because part of your rate includes a transfer. There's also a second challenge, phase 2 of that trial, which related to their budget that got adopted with the transfer in it. So there was a challenge to that saying, you can no longer do that transfer because this is a post-Prop 26 world, so that's no longer going to fly without a vote. So the court held that, the plaintiffs, as I said, they argued that, you wouldn't need to do this electric rate if you didn't have the transfer. And the defendants countered by saying, well, you know what, that transfer has been in effect since before Proposition 26, so we think it's grandfathered. We don't think a vote is necessary. So here's what the court held. In Phase 1, which was the challenge to the electric rate increase, the court held that Proposition 26 doesn't apply, and it reached its ruling on grandfathering grounds. It said you've had this transfer in effect since prior to Proposition 26. Therefore, even if you adopt a rate increase after the date of Proposition 26 that includes a transfer, you're not running afoul of Proposition 26 because that's a pre-existing grandfathered cost to the utility. Therefore, you can proceed without a vote. And the reasoning is because Proposition 26 is not retroactive. So even if you have a post-Proposition 26 legislation, like the rate increase, authorizing the non-rate components, the transfer, it was viable. So in the second phase of the trial, that was the challenge to the budget. And again, the court at the trial level ruled in favor of the City of Reading. It held that adopting the budget resolution did not trigger Proposition 26 because the transfer was a grandfathered, pre-existing obligation of the utility budget. And the court also held, interestingly, that the transfer could reasonably be considered a cost of electric service. And I have a lengthy quote here. The key point is that the court said that requiring the city to put its electric rates out to a vote every time a rate increase is necessary cannot reasonably be deemed to be an intended consequence of Proposition 26. And it found that including there was called the pilot, that's their transfer, as part of the cost is reasonably a cost of providing the service. Therefore, it still fell within that exception that we've been talking about. So, applying this to the City of Glendale rate. The Glendale transfer requirement, like the Reading requirement, predates Proposition 26. It's been on the books since before November of 2010. Therefore, it's a grandfathered cost to the Glendale utility, just as it was to the City of Reading utility, even though the city is now looking at a potential electric rate increase, which includes that transfer. The transfer amount in Glendale has not been increased over the pre-Proposition 26 approved cap, that 25% cap that's authorized by the voter-approved provision in the charter. So it falls within the grandfathering. Secondly, that exception we looked at, the product or service exception, it falls within that as well, and it is therefore not a tax which is required to be voted upon. As I said, in order to fall within that section, streetlights and traffic signals would need to be funded through non-rate revenue. But because that product or service exception applies, Proposition 26's voter approval requirements don't apply, and the city can proceed with its electric rate increase. So that concludes my presentation, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
I have a question. So are you saying then, because it seems like both the case that you're citing and the argument you're making is that much of this is because of the grandfathering clause. So if we were looking at a transfer today for the first time, that it would be subject to Prop 26?
Absolutely.
Okay. Other questions?
A follow-up to that question, if we were to increase this transfer today, would that be subject to Prop 26?
If we were to extend, impose, or increase it, and an increase could be changing the methodology. Let's say we decided that it needs to be 50%, or it needs to be, electric rate revenue plus something else. Totally come up with a different mathematical theory for how we do it. Yes, that would trigger.
Not the methodology. For example, the city manager indicated that he'll be dropping the transfer each year. But what if he changes his mind and the city council approves an increase from the previous year? Does Prop 26 apply now?
No, because that's not a change in the methodology. So anything, as long as you're below 25%, you're still within that methodology that was grandfathered.
Okay.
And then one other question I had was this, again, it's going back to the case, but transfer could reasonably be considered a cost of electric service. I'm confused by how the transfer can be equated with electric service when technically it's money going out to other purposes.
The way the court looked at it is that it's a cost of doing business, just like a business might have to pay taxes for something that's not directly related to the service they're providing, but it's a cost of business to them. Mm-hmm. Just as maybe a private utility has to pay dividends to ratepayers, that sort of thing. It's a cost, a regulatory cost that they incur. If you look at that lengthy quote that I didn't read you the whole thing, it goes into more detail on that.
Oh, I see. All business enterprises have costs and expenses that area cost of doing business. It still seems to me like it's pushing the limits a little bit in terms of the interpretation. This is just my non-lawyer layman's perspective in terms of looking at the general fund transfer as a cost of doing business, because it's really unrelated to the business that you're in. And at that point, then you're looking at it being a tax, which takes you down that other road, right? Which is, if it were a tax, then it would be subject to Prop 26.
Yeah, meaning you'd have to take it out for a vote.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is one court's interpretation. Like I said, this is really a brand new law, and it's definitely going to get further clarified through additional litigation. This is a trial court decision that I'm sure will get appealed, so we don't have the final word yet.
Okay, but based on what's out there today, your interpretation is that that we're okay the way we are, but should precedent be set in another direction, you might revise your opinion in the
Correct.
future.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Fairly clear.
Okay.
Thanks for such a good presentation.
Yeah, thank you. We do have a couple of speakers. Mr. Aram Kazazian. And by the way, I am going to keep the time limit at its full amount, even though we're about to run out of time because of the importance of this particular subject, but I may reduce oral comments.
Thank you, because this is a lengthy subject. I wish we would have split it. Anyway, okay. I want to inform, number one, my name is Aram Kazajian, by the way, that the city is in violation of the Prop 218 now. The reason they're in violation because they have transferring money from the water, which we're not supposed to, into electric of $2 million a year. And then that money is being transferred into the general fund. The general fund transfer was $19 million last year. That was increased by $2.5 million this year. So it went to $21.5 million instead of $19 million. And then when people complained, and then they threw a little pacifier to the people and said, okay, we're going to reduce it by $200,000, keep you guys happy. That's like throwing a pacifier in front of a child. That's what happened. The goal is not to, the problem is, that money that's being transferred is not used for parks or the libraries. It's not being used for that. That money is being transferred to the redevelopment. Okay, that's what really bugs me. Right now, the city of Glendale has transferred in the last 10 years, $215 million has been transferred to the general fund. From the general fund, that money was transferred to the Glendale Redevelopment Agency. Right now, Glendale Redevelopment Agency owes the city general fund $315 million. And then that particular money is being distributed to wealthy developers for the high-rise buildings downtown, whatever. They're giving free land, they're giving seed money. That's what's being used. So our Glendale Water and Power funds are being transferred here, then transferred over there, then given away. That's what's happening. I mean, this is what really is disturbing. So we really are in violation of Prop 26 too. Not only 218 now, we're in 26 violation according to the new what I just learned over here. So this is one thing you need to look into it. So we have a problem right there. And then the next one is that I'm going to go back to in 2009. Our reserves in Glendale Water and Power was $127 million. And by the end of 2011, this fund dropped down to $38 million. We lost $90 million of the reserves in 2.5 years of Glendale Water Power. Where is this money? I've asked this question. There's no answers. Nobody can answer me. No finance cannot answer me. I asked for backups. I can't get it. Where is that money? Where is the $90 million disappeared to? We had that money in reserves, and it disappeared. I also asked about the depreciation fund. We have $37 million in depreciation fund. Like Commissioner Yao said, the depreciation fund is, if I'm going to buy a truck for my business, I'm going to spend $50,000 for that truck, and I'm going to depreciate that truck, but I want to also put a depreciation fund so I can buy that truck in 10 years down the line where it's nothing there. I can rebuild it. But where is that $37 million on that pie chart, which you don't have in front of you now, unfortunately? There's a pie chart. You look at, there's $37 million. Where is that money? and I couldn't get an answer. I asked in the finance, there's no answers. I cannot get where is the answer. It was never answered. That question was never answered to me. Then I'm going to go to why we're not charging large developers connection fees, water and power connection fees. We gave Disney $2.5 million of Glendale water and power fees, connection fees, free. I came to this council when they were voting on it. I said, why are we giving $2.5 million of Glendale water and power money into Disney? This is a big company. They have money. They already are not paying property taxes. The public are paying their property tax. For 50 years, we're going to pay for property taxes. And then they still gave it $2.5 million. I objected to that. They still transferred. They still gave them $2.5 million out of Glendale Water and Power. So that alone generates a vote of the public. That's another violation. I mean, I can go on. And then we lost $14 million for just relocating the street, the towers on Glendale Yard. $14 million was spent for the flyover bridge that was put in, and then Steiger forgot to apply for a refund on that from the federal government. So $14 million went to disappeared. And thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, Mr. Harry Zavos.
Before I begin, let me explain what's being passed out to you. It's a working paper that deals both with the transfer and with the Props 26 issue. There are references to exhibits that are not included. There are only 2 exhibits. The first one, only parts of the exhibit are included. The second one, the entire exhibit is included. Commissioners, I must say I'm put off by this procedure. I put a lot of time into this, and when I checked the agenda, this item did not appear on the agenda on Friday, nor did this legal analysis appear. So here I am to respond to this based on what I heard here as the presentation was made. Who knows whether I can, in the short time, make a response to all the items raised. First, let me say that I'm interested in the legalities. I happen to believe that the charter is a fundamental law of the city. I happen also to believe that in the state constitution that says it can only be amended by a vote of the people, not by accounting principles. So my position is that, in fact, the city must comply with the charter, be it wise or unwise. It's a fundamental law of the city. Now, let me just quickly deal with the matter of the transfers. As has been said, the only transfer of GWP that can be put to use other than for GWP purposes comes out of the surplus fund. Now, the statement has been made that 25% of the operating budget is transferred to the surplus fund. That's simply not true. Look at the last page of your exhibits, which indicates the appropriations for this year. And if you look down at the bottom, you'll see that the transfer comes directly out of the Electric Works Revenue Fund and the Electrical Works Water Revenue Funds. They don't come out of the surplus fund. They're budgeted to come out of those revenue funds. Now, let me also indicate that if you will look on page 1 to the exhibit that has the flow chart, the very next page, and then you'll see that one after that is 22. It is true that it talks about the transfer being 25% of the operating budget of GWP. I don't quarrel with that, but go on to read what it says. It says, shall be transferred from said Glendale Water and Power Surplus Fund to the General Reserve Fund. It doesn't say from the revenue funds, which is the repository of all receipts. It says from the surplus fund. And you can't transfer any more from the surplus fund than what's in it. And what defines what goes into it is section 20, the last paragraph. I don't have time to read it, but let me read 22 of that first paragraph that you're already looking at. A fund to be known as the General Water and Power Surplus Fund is hereby created, to which fund shall be credited from the receipts of the Department of Water and Power in the Waterworks Revenue Fund and Electrical Works Revenue Fund any amounts in excess of the requirements of the several funds as herein set forth. Those several funds include the Revenue Fund, which means you have to take care of budgeted appropriations which have not been paid within the given fiscal year, as well as the Depreciation Fund. Now that defines what goes into the surplus fund. Once into the surplus fund, that 25% defines what can come out of the surplus fund. In point of fact, the city may genuflect toward the general the GWP surplus fund, but in point of fact, what it does is it takes the receipts right out of the revenue fund, which violates the charter. Furthermore, I would ask you to read carefully what I've presented and tell me if you can see what meaning can be attached to the last paragraph of section 20, which also indicates the inflow, what goes into the surplus fund, the credit balance, if any or any part thereof, in each of said funds at the end of each fiscal year, the amount of which is in excess of the amount of all outstanding demands and liabilities unpaid from said fund on account of budgeted appropriations, therefore shall be transferred to the Glendale Water and Power Surplus Fund. Well, if 25% of operating revenues can go into the surplus fund and then from the surplus fund out of the surplus fund, then this limitation here is meaningless because it doesn't say 25%. It says only what's left after you take care of budgeted appropriations. And the same with what meaning can you attach to Section 22 if you take serious the city attorney's legal analysis. And finally, I would have you look. Let me just finish. And I think this time period is unfair for such a complicated and extensive presentation, but let me just read the last part of Section 14, General Budget Fund, which takes care of libraries and police and so forth. The last sentence is, it says, the first paragraph says, a fund to be known as a General Budget Fund is hereby created. All receipts from the general tax levy, license, fees, permits, and interest on bank accounts, and all other receipts, and then I read this, except those from the Department of Glendale Water and Power. So 14 says Glendale Water and Power funds are not credited to take care of libraries, police. And I would ask if you accept the analysis of the city attorney's office, what meaning you can give to section 20, 22, and 14 that I've just read. I have no time to respond on Proposition 26, and so.
I have a quick question. Yep. You can stay or go. My questions have to do with what you just said. My questions are to staff or to the attorney. What's up with the posting of the public agenda? Mr. Zava says he didn't see item 3B on the public agenda.
Ms. Dentler, I can answer that. This is the agenda that you have before you is what we distributed Friday morning, Ms. Melendez, and included in that was the city attorney's opinion.
It's the agenda that came to me, so I'm wondering.
It's the agenda that went out to the public, Ms. Dentler.
Public agenda?
Absolutely.
And I must have, I'm an ignoramus when it comes to computers, but I thought I checked the agenda for this month, and I didn't see this.
It's important, so I want to make sure our record shows that we did properly agendize the item. And my other question is Mr. Zavas, you obviously put so much time and thought and analysis, and you're always bringing us handouts, and I know you've done an enormous amount of research and advocacy, but I guess I'm just one commissioner, but I'm never really clear on what exactly do you want this commission to do?
Commissioner Detler, I want this commission to there's very little you can do. You're just an advisory.
Right.
Yeah.
So
but the public does listen, and I want these questions to be put to the city and an answer to be demanded. I've come here before this commission and indicated ways, for example, in which water fees are still being used in violation of Proposition 218 to subsidize the general fund. And I've given some of you a handout with an analysis on that. I expect this commission to put those questions to the city attorney. I expect them to put to the city attorney why and whether or not the GWP surplus fund, when it talks about 25% of the operating revenues, talks about 25% of the operating revenues from.
You don't need to go up back.
Right. So those are the
bottom line. Is your bottom line that you don't want any more funds transferred, or is your bottom line that you want the public to vote?
My bottom line is I want my city to obey the fundamental law of the city, the charter, and I believe it is not. And I've raised issues to indicate why it's not. And I get 5 minutes. I only can expand that by giving you written material in the hopes that you will ask the very same questions I raise in my documents as I raise them.
Okay, thank you.
May I respond to the comments made? I really just want to clear up this issue and leave no misunderstanding about what the city attorney's position is. And I know, Mr. Zavos, that you presumably have more to say, and as you know, there will be another opportunity at the city council where these same issues are being presented, and I hope that you and encourage you to attend that meeting as well. But with regard to the issues raised by both of the speakers, first there was an allegation that the city is in violation of Proposition 218, and that's simply not the case. The discussion pertained to the reallocation between electric and water, and we've discussed this with this commission before. Formerly, it was a straight 75-25 split, which, if anything, that's not consistent with Proposition 218 because it doesn't do that detailed look at what the allocation really should be based on costs. So that was adjusted, reassessed, and based on that, the transfer amount to the electric was increased, but it was based on a more proper allocation of funds within those two sections of the department. So that is not a violation of Proposition 218. With regard to the charter, it is definitely the fundamental law of the city. I don't disagree with that. Where the transfer comes from, I think part of the confusion on this issue relates to the fact that the city had been doing the transfer on a monthly basis, which does create confusion as to, A, is the city budgeting for a surplus, and B, what comes out of what fund. But by clearing this up and doing that at the end of the year, I think that issue will go away. And again, I think that's somewhat
meaning
of a
that funds, the transfer amounts will be put into the surplus fund and then transferred at the end of the year.
Absolutely, yes. This issue with regard to 20 and 22, the talk about the surplus, I touched on that just briefly. That's the inflow into the surplus fund. You can't read away the section that talks about the fact that what gets transferred is the operating revenue. Now, you remember there's some years that are maybe lean years and other years that are fatter years where there's more money put into that surplus fund. So when you're looking at that maximum 25% transfer, you don't just look at the annual surplus for that year. You've got a whole fund sitting there from which the money is taken. So I think that point needs to be made.
Well, and I also think, again, the issue comes into some of the interpretation. So, for example, if we look at Section 20 and we're talking about which is in excess of the amount of all outstanding demands and liabilities unpaid from said fund, that type of language, if you look at things just from that year, just that specific year you're looking at, you could say we do have, we have met all our demands and liabilities. If you look at it from a longer term perspective, you may come to the conclusion that no, we have to plan for future funding of XYZ capital projects, and therefore part of our budgeting needs to incorporate that sort of planning, which would mean we look at that even though it's a future year demand and liability. We're looking at what the needs are in the current year to work toward meeting that demand and liability.
May I respond? I'm simply reading the language of the charter. I think it's always good to look at the language. And when we're looking at the language of 20, it says, the credit balance, if any, or any part thereof in each of said funds at the end of the fiscal year, it requires at the end of the year you look to see if there's any surplus. And it says, if any, which contemplates there may be none. And I'm simply wedded to the language. I also, with respect to 2010-22, would again indicate I have no problem with the definition of what can come out of the surplus fund. It is 25% of the operating budget, but it is 25% of the operating budget that comes from the GWP reserve fund to go into the general GWP surplus fund into the general reserve fund. It doesn't say that, in fact, from the revenue funds, which are the repository of all the receipts from GWP, that they come from those funds into the general fund. And that's precisely the practice of the city, as indicated by the appropriations that are given to you from the approved budget over the last 3 years.
Okay. I'm going to move us on to the next final agenda. Oh, sorry.
Just a final comment. I think, from what I understand, the city attorney was recommending that for future purposes, the GWP will put that monthly amount now it allocates to the transfer to the surplus into the surplus fund, from which then at the end of the year a transfer will make to the city. Correct?
We're recommending that the transfer be done at the end of the year. That's correct.
Out of the surplus fund, I'm assuming.
Yes, as I believe it's done now.
But can I also indicate...
One second. My only then question would be, when it's there, then you will take a look at your definition of how, how reserves are funded and how properly, what proper reserves should be. And I would assume a reserve should be a demand or some sort of liability of the water and power. And then if that reserve is met, then maybe the transfer or a portion of the transfer applies. So, I mean, if you're doing that, going that extra step, now you're going to have to answer that question. Well, okay, it's in the surplus fund, but now are we meeting our definitions of what our reserves should be?
So that's not really a legal question.
That's a management
That's more
question.
of a policy
Sure.
issue, and that's something that is reasonable to look at.
Yep. We are moving on to the next agenda item.
Can I just say one thing? I think it has to be explained then how you can budget for a surplus, because the Section 20, the last paragraph, indicates that what can go to the General Reserve Fund isn't a budgeted surplus. It's what's left after you've taken care of all budgeted appropriations. And it seems to me you do violence to the language of Section 20 if, in fact, what you do is you budget for a surplus, and then the charter says that what goes to the GWP surplus fund is what is left, if any, after all budgeted appropriations have been taken care of.
Thank you very much.
I think I covered that in my presentation.
Yep. Well, and it goes back to the issues that I previously commented on. Next agenda item.
5, agenda forecast.
Yeah, next one's oral communications.
Oh, I'm sorry. Or oral communication.
Okay, Mr. Aram Kazazian. I'm going to limit this to 3 minutes.
No problem. I don't have too
because
much
we
to
got
say
right
anyway.
away.
Aram Kazazian, I appreciate
So 3 minutes on the
I
comments.
appreciate your time, by the way. What I'd like to say again, that 26, I don't have time to study it, so I can't say much, but I'm really disturbed at what's going on with the money from the ratepayers is going into the general fund, and from the general funds going to redevelopment, and still going on, still to this day, that's been funded. That's what's really bothering me. So we don't want any rate increases. We don't want any rate increase at all, because any rate increase that you pass along, it's going to go to the cycle. It's not going to library. It's not going to police. It's not going to fire. It's going to redevelopment. They're going to be transferring another over $100 and some million from the general fund into redevelopment again. So that's the ratepayers' money that's going there. That's why I object to it. And giving the money away, as I said, right now, as I understand, some developers with their own mod, they said, we're not going to be paying any connection fee on Central Avenue. They're going to be doing all the sidewalks, curbs, and gutters for free, all the connection. Even Ramon said they're going to be paying, but I understand they're not going to be paying, so I still don't have all the facts on that. So they're going to get all that free. They're going to get our money for free. So we're going to pay more money to go over there. And we don't want that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Zavos.
Very quickly, and I'm sorry, I know we want to all get home, but those are some pretty serious allegations, and those are allegations that Mr. Kazazian made at the community meetings as well, and I believe staff has asked for the support for what he's saying about funds being shifted to redevelopment and to private developers. So far, there's, to my knowledge, been no information forthcoming.
That's correct, Mr. President, members of the Commission. We've answered the question. I've answered it a couple different ways. Redevelopment, as you know, no longer exists. And while I don't know all of the details of how the redevelopment agency works, I certainly know the details of the Central Avenue project, and that isn't being paid by GWP or the ratepayers. That's being paid by the Public Works Department out of the Capital Improvement Fund, which is primarily gas tax. There is the hope is that we can get some remaining bond proceeds from the ex-redevelopment agency, if you will, to help us with that project. So I've answered that question. I don't know how else to answer it, but that is not ratepayer money unless there is some portion of that project that's directly related to the electrical or water distribution systems or substructure upgrades as part of the overall project. The rest of that comes out of gas tax monies.
Thank you.
But my understanding of the public speakers is that when you transfer to the general fund, that gets into, part of my terminology, a slush fund, where people can use that for city council can decide what to use that on, regardless of how it's being used.
I disagree with that. That money, as we've stated, goes into the general fund operations. I don't know how it's exactly split, but it goes into police, fire, public works, parks, libraries, the core general fund operations. I've never heard before about any connection to the redevelopment agency, but I can tell you that's where the general fund money goes, and specifically with Central, that's a project being funded through the Public Works Department.
But it's unlikely that you can track the actual dollar that goes from GWP to the general fund and where that money went to the police fire. There's no DNA on that currency to really track it.
As I mentioned, Commissioner Yao, I can't give you the percentages of which department that gets that, but it is the overall general fund that receives that, and no part of the general fund is redevelopment. No part of it is the capital improvement budget. That falls under a separate budget altogether.
Well, can I ask? Sorry. We're hearing repeatedly from the same public speakers, and my memory is beginning to blur a little bit on which agenda item they were speaking on. But I didn't want to leave unaddressed or ask staff or the attorney to say something to address the fact that the record of today's meeting is going to leave standing an accusation that $20 million disappeared from GWP's reserve fund, which I also think is a very serious allegation. And I wondered if you wanted to comment.
Sure.
So it's not just out there on the record.
I appreciate you mentioning that, Mr. President, members of the Commission. As I understood it, because I've also heard that same accusation made at some of our community meetings, there was a drawdown on reserves. I don't think those numbers are accurate. They're not the same numbers I've seen, but it really doesn't matter, I guess,
it does
overall.
Matter.
No, I'm just saying, if you want to talk about, was it 39 million or 38, or the reason for the drawdown on those reserves, and that's the part I'm telling you.
Today's accusation was 90 million disappeared from reserves.
That did not disappear. That was invested into the infrastructure. We were at a time when our infrastructure was lacking, and we made a substantial investment into that infrastructure. Mr. Aboyega is here. He can talk to you a little bit more detail about that. I can give you that detail. But there was a period of time as we were coming out of the deregulation era and moving forward when our infrastructure was woefully lacking. And we made huge investments into that, and that drew down on the reserves. It didn't disappear. It was reinvested into our infrastructure. And quite frankly, it's what got us on the way to where we are today with regards to our reliability and the quality of the electrical service that we're providing today.
Mr. Obeg, do you want to comment at all? You got up, so I figured
I
not
was
getting up just to wander.
Just whispering him to be brief because this isn't agendized.
Yeah.
I can answer the question. We did explain to the public that during the community meetings, we expressed to them, showed them the amount of money we spend in investing into the infrastructure, demonstrated that back in '05, when we said that we needed about $100 million to invest into the infrastructure, we did that. We raised the rates, borrowed some funds. In continuing with the programs, we had planned on borrowing some more money through bonds back in 2008, 2009, which we didn't, but we continued to draw down using our cash reserve. And we can show every penny that was spent went into the investing into the infrastructure.
So would it be fair to say that if any member of the public wants to see what year reserves were spent and what they were spent on, that's public information, and the accusation that we heard today that the finance department refuses to answer or that the figures just don't exist, I'm sure you would be happy to respond to any member of the public who wanted to know information about that.
Absolutely. We can provide any records that anyone wants or any information.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to make a point here. I've heard a lot of comments made today, and I agree with a lot of my commissioners. And I also understand Mr. Zern's point, how GWP is a part of the city, and we do all need to share the sacrifices. And now, and the city council, the council members will have to ultimately make the tough decisions, and we have put them there, so I'm confident that they'll be able to make the right decision. All I'm asking for is moving forward with the possibility of no rate increase and the transfer still happening. I am requesting that things be transparent. A list of projects that are going to be cut should be brought to us immediately. Last meeting, we talked about the $10 million cut in the Smart Grid program. That was a surprise to many of us. And so I'm saying, moving forward, to share the pain, and we all need to sacrifice, but we need transparency. So any similar cuts to the one we made to Smart Grid, we need to discuss it and be aware of.
Mr. President, Commissioner Chan, forgive me, I had thought that the utility had presented to the Commission the budget that they were proposing. Okay. With that said, how about if I come back to you and show you that budget, the budget that the utility presented to the City Council, which at least for this year, it was referred to as a zero-based budget. We can show you what exactly isn't going to be done this year. And then in the long term, you made an excellent point about showing what else from this year on could potentially be unfunded if we don't have some of the revenue enhancements that we've been talking about. But I know that question's come up to commission meetings now, and forgive me, I would have assumed that had been done, but I was wrong. So let me do that. I will bring it back to you. It's after the fact because we're already into the new fiscal year, but I can have the staff go through the same presentation that was given to the council so you can at least see the situation that we're in and some of the things that we aren't getting done. I agree. I did notice your look of dismay when we were going through just the smart grid update that included that one particular aspect. But essentially, we've zeroed out the capital budget altogether. But let me bring back the details so that you can see that and be aware of it.
But I think part of Commissioner Chan's point is that should City Council in your future presentation to them decide that they're going to indefinitely postpone the rate increase, that's obviously going to have some future implications. And so we would like to be part of that process of deliberation in terms of whether or not there needs to be appropriate advocacy with City Council to say, therefore, perhaps general fund transfer needs to be reduced by X amount in order to accommodate this or that capital project that is absolutely essential that it get done this year. In other words, let's not assume by the same token that the pain is all GWPs. If they decide that electric rate increases are not going to happen now, there potentially could be a ripple effect in other parts of the city operation, not just GWP go absorb this now.
Well, and Mr. President, when I bring back in September, I know we're going to do our look ahead in a minute here. But when I bring back to you that budget presentation for September, I'll also bring you a report on the August 14th City Council meeting
That'd be great.
and what their direction was.
And your outlook on what implications that may have.
Absolutely.
So that we can appropriately, as a commission, also advise council back to say this or that, here's this or that implication for the general fund transfer. So therefore, then they'd have to go and revisit other parts of the city budget as well to say, maybe we need to make some trade-offs here.
We'll bring that to you in September.
Okay. We do have one more speaker, Mr. Zavos.
Thank you, Mr. Armedian. Some quick comments. Ms. Dentler, I understood your comment perfectly. When I've asked for documents being prepared like this report early on, the city attorney's office has indicated under work product privilege, it's up to the city council to release it. So it's clear that the obligation of the city attorney's office is to the city council first and foremost, as opposed to the general public. Secondly, Mr. Yao, your analogy about a depreciation fund is apt. Let me give you another one. When I was practicing, I knew that when a new condominium project was put together and you were getting approval from the Department of Real Estate to sell, the Department of Real Estate required you to submit a budget. And they required as part of that budget that a certain amount of money be set aside for capital, for depreciation. So, for example, from the monthly fee, a certain amount of money had to be put aside if you had an elevator, because you knew pretty soon you'd have to maintain that elevator. Or a certain money had to be put aside each month for the roof, because you knew 20 years from now you'd have to have a new roof. And so when that new roof came due, you didn't go to the then condominium owners and assess them for a new roof. That's precisely what the depreciation fund in the charter is intended to do. And it's clear that's not happening. For example, at the outreach on this proposed electrical fee, we were told that the increase in the electrical fees will average $20 million a year over the next 4 years. That's $1 million less than what's being transferred. And the charter makes it clear that before any money goes into the surplus fund, from which it then can be transferred to the general reserve fund, not the general budget fund.
Mr. Zavos, we covered this. We're on oral communication.
I'm addressing Mr. Yao's comments about the general proposition of taking, I'm going to use up my time. I'm responding to Mr. Yao's statement when he talked about his understanding, not from a legal point of view, from a business point of view. And I'm saying that there's a second analogy comparable to your analogy about that money being set aside. And consistent with your analogy, let me point out that the first paragraph of Section 22 of Article 11 of the Charter indicates that any money that goes into the surplus fund has to be after all the other funds have been taken care of, including the depreciation fund. Now we're seeking a 2% or whatever it is, an electrical increase in order to take care of depreciation. All the time we're transferring $21 million of electrical fees to the general fund.
Thank you very much.
I have a question for the attorney. I'm sorry. May I? So now the accusation, or one assertion, is that if a member of the public were interested in finding out, for instance, the $20 million, no, $90 million or so for infrastructure improvements, that the attorney would assert a work product privilege. Is that information not?
I didn't say that.
So there's no bar to the members of the public learning about the expenditures of the reserve funds, right?
No, there's no bar to that. If we have a city attorney opinion, typically those are attorney-client privileged, and we do give those to the city council. They have the right to waive that privilege. We do not. So in this case, they waived the privilege, and they wanted us to go ahead and produce a public opinion, and we did so.
I see. Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Okay, next agenda item.
5, agenda forecast.
Just have a comment about the agenda forecast, but agenda in particular. I mean, it was raised that today's agenda wasn't noticed public, I guess, properly, that the presentation by the city attorney and the report was not available ahead of time. And I can see why that is, because my understanding is some public members don't have access to the internet, and the one posted pretty much has a link to the report and the presentation. But if the member of the public didn't have the internet access or computer access, is the report or the link to presentations available where this is posted by paper? So everything is available right at the desk?
Absolutely. Either you can come to our office, you could have come to the city attorney's office to ask for the opinion paper, but we have it available. If you can't pick it up via...
For example, like 3B, it says overview of legal analysis regarding general fund and transfer proposition 26, and I noticed that on the agenda electronically, there's a link to that section. If someone clicks on it, you go to our report. But if it's posted, let's say, outside of City Hall, is that report available right there too?
Absolutely. So we have to post it 72 hours in advance, and then it also goes to the city clerk's office, so anyone can get a copy.
Well, yeah, and it's in the full report is in the package, but what was not in the package was the actual PowerPoint presentation.
That's correct, and that wasn't ready to go until today, but that really just summarizes what's in the written report. It's the same thing.
So how many of these report, let's say the legal analysis that was provided, was at the posting in the city?
How many
The full analysis was posted according to the overall posting in advance.
No,
What wasn't posted is the PowerPoint that you saw today, which is a summary of the more in-depth
So people
full
can
analysis.
actually get the paper copy of the full report?
Yes.
Yeah, which is part of what you see in your package too.
Because I just heard that the public speaker didn't get a chance to review the report and the legal analysis.
Yep. So what was in the full packet is the full analysis, which looks like it's about 30 pages or so. What was not in is the PowerPoint, which is a summary based on the more in-depth. So if I could ask staff to also email around the PowerPoint presentation to the commission, that would be great. Just so we
Are you
have
talking about the PowerPoint presentation that was presented in the meetings, the public
Yes.
meetings? The
Well,
public,
today.
no, because there's another presentation that we will be getting tomorrow.
Yeah,
We'll be
that's the second.
We'll be getting all those.
That's the second one.
We'll include the legal PowerPoint.
Talking about Ms. Godinez's presentation?
Yes.
We were talking about what was used in the public meetings.
Right. And did somebody just suggest putting that one up as well? The public meeting presentation?
Is that not up on the GWP site?
It is. I don't know if it's still up on the site. It was on the site. It's also what we showed as part of our ongoing GTV6.
For a while it was, though.
But the question was, my statement was, I'll send that to you,
Right.
email copy of that.
Yeah.
I'll send you this PowerPoint, and I will also send you the comments that Mr. Powers is finalizing.
Yes.
Right.
So while they were doing the public meetings, it was up on the GWP site, but it's not anymore.
That's good to know. I did not even think to look there.
Oh, yeah, it was. It ran the whole time.
Okay.
Not to mention you could watch it live being presented as well.
Over and over and
I
over.
was on vacation, but I would have looked on the website. Didn't.
Okay, if we could look in your packet, there's the agenda forecast, and look ahead to September 24th. Remember, we changed the date on the September one because of the Labor Day issue.
Mr. President, if I could just offer some suggestions, because even as we spoke today, we kind of changed things. There's a number of items. There's the 90-day report from the interim general manager. I had just indicated that if you were willing, we would give you the presentation of the budget as it was presented to the council during the budget study session. Also, effective September 1st, there'll be a number of changes within the department in regards to staffing, because that's the effective date of all of the retirements and layoffs. So at President Armenian's suggestion, I think what I would like to do is, if you're okay with that, is to bring back to you an org chart that shows you, at least from the top management level, how the organization now looks in light of those changes that will have occurred and been effective September 1st. So if you'd like, I can add those things to the agenda. That probably makes a pretty beefy agenda for that day, but if there was anything else you want to add, we certainly can do that.
Yeah, I think with the addition of those elements, we're looking at too much for the next agenda, so I think we should look at what can be deferred. For example, if we can defer water department.
Underground districts
update.
is not pressing. You can move that one if you like.
So why don't we move underground districts to the October meeting? And then what about, we have a water update in November as well. So unless there's something pressing on the water side, I would suggest we eliminate that
Okay,
altogether.
we will
And we'll
do
just
that.
pick it up in November. Is everyone okay with that?
Yes.
Okay. So that would remove two elements. And then I'd like to maintain the discipline on the customer service update. What about smart grid?
My sense is you'll get a pretty good overview of smart grid within the budget presentation, at least as we stand today. Certainly, we can expand on our questions from there, but
Okay, so that too we have on November as well.
Do we have an update on, or were we going to get it later, on whether the federal government gave us the extension?
we can certainly update you on that if we have that information, absolutely.
Okay, maybe you can make that part of the budget. 'Cause
We
it's
can certainly
financial.
do that, yeah.
So to summarize, we will eliminate the update on water department. We will move underground districts to the October meeting, and we will eliminate the smart grid update. And instead, in addition to your 90-day assessment, you'll also give a presentation of the past budget that was approved, as well as a report on the organizational changes. Did I miss anything? Okay. If there are no other questions, do I have a...
I was just going to suggest, is there something pressing on the NERC WEC compliance program? Is that something that needs to be done? I can imagine.
A little bit. Small amount.
Okay.
We can do it very quickly,
Okay.
Commissioner Jamian.
Thank you.
Anything that has the word compliance, I just leave in
And I
there.
think we moved that already, so...
Okay. Any other questions on the agenda at this point? Okay. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. We're adjourned.